This is the central north-south axis running through Beijing. The axis starts at Yongdimen, or the Gate of Everlasting Peace, and ends at the Drum and Bell Tower. The 8-kilometer-long axis runs like a spinal cord through old Beijing. Beijing has a long history. It was here Peking man lived and labored perhaps 500,000 years ago. Beijing as a city has a history of more than 3,000 years. In the Western Zhou dynasty in about 1100 BC, it became the capital of the state of Yan. Later it was an important township in the north and the capital for local administrators during the Han, Tang, and Song dynasties. The Liao dynasty made Beijing its secondary capital in the 10th century, and it has served as the capital for 4 dynasties, the Jin, Yuan, Ming, and Qing, since the 12th century. Historical records describe Beijing as a beautiful place surrounded by mountains to the west, north, and northeast. The Italian traveler Marco Polo praised the scenic city and its layout, saying that he was at a loss for words to portray it. Beijing possesses rich and mystical treasures. In its long years, people of various nationalities have added to its splendid history and culture, and left countless relics, gardens, and scenic spots. Gathering together the best of the world and inheriting legacies of the ages, Beijing has become a huge treasure house of historical relics and living culture. The Forbidden City, the former imperial palace, is the most magnificent, the largest, and most complete ensemble of traditional Chinese architecture. Construction began in 1406. The entire palace covers an area of 720,000 square meters with some 9,000 rooms. 24 emperors of the Ming and Qing dynasties resided here. Within the Forbidden City are housed great numbers of artifacts and national treasures. Strolling through the palace seems like a journey back down the long corridor of history. With its splendor, exact layout, and magnificent architecture, the Forbidden City is China's ancient masterpiece. The Temple of Heaven is the largest temple in China and covers 2.73 million square meters. The temple was built in 1420 as a place for the Ming emperors to worship heaven and pray for good harvests. The Temple of Heaven's buildings shine with colors. Most of them are circular and roofed with blue glazed tiles, as though the temple was built in the skies. Its unique layout, forceful patterns, ingenious structures, and rich colors have made the Temple of Heaven world-renowned. The Temple of Earth stands apart, facing the Temple of Heaven. It was built in 1530. As one of Beijing's 9 temples and 8 monasteries, it was the place where Ming and Qing emperors worshipped the earth. The Jade Islet is the center of Beihai Park. The wide Dagobah on the hilltop is surrounded by halls and pavilions. The layout of Beihai Park was designed according to an ancient Chinese myth about 3 mountains where the gods live high above the waters of all the rivers. The park is 800 years old. It was first created in the Jin dynasty as an imperial garden, and later dynasties renovated and added to it. People call the beautiful Beihai Park a jeweled palace on a fairyland hill. Jinshan Hill to the east of Beihai Park served as an imperial garden in the Yuan, Ming, and Qing dynasties. The Wanchun Pavilion at the top of the 43-meter-high hill was the center and highest point of old Beijing. The central north-south axis runs through it. Construction of the fabulous imperial garden Yuanmingyuan in the western suburbs of Beijing began in 1709 during the reign of Emperor Kangxi. It covers an area of 3.2 million square meters. It took 150 years to complete Yuanmingyuan, digging the lakes, building up the hills, planting trees and flowers of all varieties. The garden recreated 40 scenic spots in China and abroad. Its 145 buildings were samples of architecture from around the known world. It reflected the highest level of achievement in landscaping in the Qing dynasty. Yuanmingyuan was praised as the finest of all the thousands of gardens of the period. Anglo-French forces invaded Beijing in 1860, looted treasures from the garden, and then burned the unique wonder to the ground. Summer Palace in the west of Yuanmingyuan was an imperial garden and temporary dwelling place of the emperor. Construction of the palace started in 1750. It was here an emperor and his family would holiday in summer and go sightseeing and celebrate their birthdays. Covering an area of almost 13 million square meters, the Summer Palace is the largest of the most intact imperial garden still existing in China. 3/4 of the palace area is water. The architectural complex has the Pavilion of the Fragrance of Buddha as its center on the front part of Longevity Hill. On the back of Longevity Hill is a group of Tibetan-style religious buildings with pagodas and pavilions contrasting finely with each other. Blue Kunming Lake lies to the south of Longevity Hill, completing the appealing scene. The Summer Palace has absorbed features of scenic spots from across the country, gathering together the cream of gardens of the south and the north. About 50 kilometers north of Beijing are the Ming tombs, 13 imperial tombs of the Ming dynasty scattered on the southern slope of Jundushan Mountain. Changling was the tomb of Zhu Di, known as Emperor Yongle. The tomb is the earliest built and largest among the 13 tombs. Dingling was the tomb of Emperor Wanli. This is the only one of the 13 that's been completely unearthed. The excavation began in May 1956, and more than 3,000 valuable cultural relics were recovered from this underground palace. The dangerously steep Juyongguan Pass is a famous strategic stronghold to the west of Jundushan Mountain. An ancient poet once called Juyongguan a natural barrier which can compete with hundreds of mountains of rivers. Called the Giant Dragon in the East, the 10,000-li Great Wall is a giant scroll unrolled across China, bearing a story of glory and suffering. Its length and size, and age and far-reaching influence give it an outstanding position in the history of the world. Construction of the Great Wall began during the Warring States period in the 5th century BC. It was reinforced and renovated during the Yuan and Ming dynasties, taking a total of 2,000 years to build. The wall starts from the bank of the Yalujiang River in the east and reaches westward to Lopnor in Xinjiang. Its total length exceeds 50,000 kilometers. The Great Wall people visit nowadays are sections built in the Ming dynasty. Most of the principal Ming Wall sections are located near Beijing. The Beijing area has about 630 kilometers of the wall, with 827 watchtowers and strongholds. Badaling is the most famous section of the Great Wall, attracting millions of Chinese and foreign tourists each year. Almost all heads of state and prominent figures who have visited China have come here. The wall built to lock out the world now brings that world to China, nurturing friendship where fear and conflict once reigned. Badaling attracts tourists with its majesty, while the Mutianyu section of the Great Wall in the north of Huairou County charms people with its beauty. The vegetation is lusher here than anywhere else along the Great Wall. Peach blossoms abound in spring, rivaled only by the colors of the autumn leaves. In grandeur, the Jinshanling section of the Great Wall near Gubeikou is second only to Badaling. Its 10-kilometer section assembles all architectural forms of the Ming Dynasty. There are 67 watchtowers and strongholds, which are rarely seen in other sections. Thus makes it an ideal place to study the building techniques of the Ming period. Watching the Capitol Tower is the highest point of the Sima Tai section of the wall. Its name comes from a legend that standing here one can see the city of Beijing. The Great Wall is truly a cultural treasure of the Chinese nation and a great architectural wonder of the world.